Let's examine the reliability of the Gospels, the chronicle of the life of Christ from 4 different authors. We do this because we do not have the original of these books, but that's the case with every work of antiquity. The first test is the bibliographical test. The first question to be answered is, how soon were the documents written after the events they recorded? Let's take a look at other documents of antiquity to see how this standard is applied. Dr. Paul Maier.
When we survey the authors from classical antiquity, the secular authors, we find a vast difference between when they wrote their works and the oldest manuscripts we have today. For example, Plato, the great philosopher, died in 347 BC, and yet the first manuscripts we have are from the 10th century AD, 1200 years later. Or let's take Herodotus, the father of history. He died in 425 BC, and yet the oldest manuscripts of any of his works date from the 10th century, some 1300 years later. There are only 8 copies of his work available for comparison. The writings of Julius Caesar and his great commentary on the Gallic Wars provide us with 10 manuscripts, only 10, dated some 1,000 years after his death. And finally, the oldest manuscript of any of Aristotle's works is dated 1,400 years after it was written. And there are only 49 copies of his work available for examination. And so we have a span of between 1,000 and 1,400 years between when these works were written and the earliest available copies we have today. And yet, most scholars consider them very reliable.
3 of the Gospels were written within a few decades of the life of Christ. The time between the original document and the earliest existing copies is less than any other work of antiquity. And the number of manuscripts available for comparison? Today, over 5,000, and that number continues to grow.
There's no question that we have today, paradoxically, the further away we're getting from the events of the first century and before, we're getting a more and more accurate text. And even with the other texts that may not be quite as accurate, there is nothing ever discovered in any of the other editions which violates any basic doctrine in the Christian faith.
There is no other group of ancient writings that even comes close to the bibliographical evidence for the trustworthiness of the New Testament. The second test is the internal test. Did the writers have the opportunity to get the story right? And are there any obvious contradictions within their work? Were they eyewitnesses to the events they record, or close associates of eyewitnesses who could easily confirm the events or not?
Well, canon is just a word that comes from Greek. Canon is a measuring stick. Eventually came to mean a rule, something you measure something with. And so the canon is that which is authoritative, that which you use to measure or evaluate other things. So with the scriptures, we evaluate other teachings, other writings. So it's canonical, it's authoritative, is what that term means.
The question of canonicity, of course, occurs to the present day yet. How do we know what is God's Word and what isn't? There were several rules for determining what should be in the canon and what should not. One rule was, of course, the account had to be written by an eyewitness or a near eyewitness. Luke, for example, was not one of the 12 apostles, but he was very close to them and had eyewitness reporting, of course, in his trips with St. Paul. So that would be an example of a near eyewitness. Then we have, of course, the second rule, and that is it must be coherent with the rest of Christian doctrine. It can't be way off the deep end somewhere. It has to be integrate very well with the rest of Christian theology. And the third rule has got to be what was used in church worship. And in the Greek-speaking churches in the East and in the Latin-speaking churches in the West, they always decided what was being read. Perhaps on the Sunday after Easter, they all reported about doubting Thomas. And so that becomes then part of the canon and part of the pericopes as well, the readings for the church year.
So the 4 Gospels pass that second test. The third test has to do with external evidence. Is there evidence from other sources that can support the historical claims of the documents? Some scholars at first denied some historical events and places of the Bible until external evidence was found.
It was quite common in history of Jesus research or historical Jesus research in the 19th, even into the 20th centuries, to question the biblical account of Jesus on the basis of historical and cultural data. So, for example, a common claim was that the resurrection story in the Gospels could not be true because that was not typical Jewish burial practice. That is to say, something like a crucified criminal like Jesus being given over to a family member or a friend for a rather elaborate burial would not have been possible. That the claim was made, for example, that if a Jewish criminal would have been crucified, the Romans would have taken his body, thrown it into a mass grave, dogs would have scattered his bones. There's no chance for resurrection. Now, granted, they could make that claim because for a long time there was no historical evidence of Roman crucifixions in Judea. No examples of burials of crucified people until, happily, in 1968, while building some apartment buildings just north of Jerusalem, some builders bulldozed open a hillside and found numerous graves. In one of these graves, they found what's called an ossuary, a bone box in which bones are placed after burial. And these bones happen to be the bones of someone who was crucified by the Romans sometime between 10 and 60 AD, so the right ballpark, roughly in his 20s from what they could determine. And strikingly, his foot actually had a 7-inch nail still stuck in it with a piece of olive wood stuck in the back. So apparently they couldn't get his feet off the cross. They just hacked the cross off and then threw the whole thing into the grave. His family came and buried it. So it's strikingly like what is described in the Gospels. Someone condemned by the Romans, crucified, nails in his hand and his feet, given over to a family member, a close friend, and given a rather elaborate burial, exactly as you see depicted in the Gospels. So it's no longer possible to claim that the Gospel narratives are complete fiction because we have examples of this sort of thing happening. Now, I happened to dig up a 1971 Time magazine article about this. It was a couple years before this evidence was published. And of course, the Time magazine article was, could this have been Jesus? Kind of a thing, rather sensationalist. But it did point out that here's the first time we have evidence of this type of burial, and it fits exactly with what we have in the Gospels. So it doesn't give us proof of the resurrection, but it certainly shows that the Bible is not fable. It's plausible the way it's described.
Skeptics have pointed out that the oldest existing copies of the Old Testament date some 1,500 years after the original writing. They assume that given the great amount of time between the original document and the oldest copy, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of errors in the text of the Old Testament.